Almost live from Monteagle, Tennessee, you're watching the 3rd Annual Engrave In 2008. Brought to you by Flintstone Engraving Tools. When you can't afford the best, go with Flintstone. In business since 1912 BC. And by General Motors. We're your car company.
No, really, we're your car company. We took lots of your taxpayer money, so we're your car company. So please buy one, or two, or three, pretty please.
With your fabulous host and all-around good guy, husband, father, engraver, and almost famous, Scott Pilkington.
What I did is I made the grip cap, and the grip cap is a little harder because if you notice it's flat. The grip cap is
like this stuff.
It's got a swoop to it. Yeah. Okay, after I fitted the grip cap, then I took another piece of steel and I carved out the face and you know kept it in a rectangle, and I did almost.
I'm just a starting knife maker and engraver, so yeah, it's very, at the very beginning phase of them both.
And where are you from?
I'm from Estonia. It's in northwest of Europe.
And you came all the way here? Why would you come all the way here for this engraving meeting?
Actually, it's 3 in 1. I came with my wife for a vacation. Also the Blade show in Atlanta and Engraving. Yeah, so it's just a lot of fun, I think.
I'm from Blairsville, Georgia, up in the North Georgia mountains, and what we're going to attempt to do in the morning is do an investment casting demonstration. And basically we've got some flash that we prepared that's got the wax already, you know, encapsulated with the investment, and I'm in the process of burning the wax out this evening, and then they'll sit there and bake overnight. And then in the morning we'll take these flasks and put them on a vacuum unit and draw vacuum through the flask and get rid of any air and all in the mold inside the flask. And we're going to pour melted silicon bronze into the castings. Melts about 1700 degrees, and we're going to attempt to cast just an assortment of different pieces and not burn the place down. Other than that, my son here, Jerry Seymour, is going to help. But that's all I know.
Well, to the average person out there, if somebody just watching on the news, tell us what as simply as you can, what casting involves. I mean, maybe that's a too hard a question, but...
Well, there's several different types, and the type that I'm going to be doing is commonly referred to as investment casting or lost wax casting. And lost wax casting is one of the oldest casting processes. That's what they used in the old days for casting the bronze statues and the horses and monuments and all, and the squares and all. And basically what it involves is the piece that you're going to cast has to be made in wax. And so all of these castings that I'll be doing, they start out as a wax model. And then you take and pour the investment around the wax inside of a flask. And the investment is, you just think of it as a real fine plaster of Paris. You mix it up with water and you pour it over the wax. And then in the process of doing the burnout, which is what we're doing tonight, the burnout of the flask heats the flask up and the wax melts out of the investment. So basically you've got like a plaster of Paris cavity. There's a cavity that was formed where the wax used to be. The wax has been lost or burnt out. That's the name lost wax casting. And when you pour the molten metal into the investment, into that cavity, it picks up the detail of the wax. Now this is one of the most accurate forms of casting that there is. For instance, when you have jewelry made, or if you have a cap or a crown made for your tooth, that's the same process that they use in the dental and the jewelry industry. I've actually taken scorpions and bumblebees and taken a bee and poured the investment around him, and then you burn him out, and you can actually pour that mold with gold, and you can see the wings and the veins in the bumblebee from that process, because the investment is so fine and so detailed. You could actually take a wax casting and put your thumbprint in it, and it will actually pick up the detail of your thumbprint, the fingerprint of your thumb in the casting. So it's a very accurate, very detailed, precision casting. Whereas if you go and do sand casting, you typically will make you'll have a wooden pattern or so forth that you use repeatedly over and over again and make impressions in the sand. And whereas the wax, once the wax is burnt out and lost, in order to do another casting, you have to start with another piece of wax. It's a degenerative process.
Now, how did you ever get started in something like this?
That's a good question. I manufacture and make miniature tools for a living, reproduction antique tools at a miniature scale, 1/3 scale, and trying to get people to do the accuracy and the detail and all that I wanted for my product. It came down to the situation where if you want it done right, you have to do it yourself, and so I taught myself the process and read a few books and hooked up with a gentleman that had, that sold supplies, and he got me started in the right direction. And the whole process is very similar to baking a cake. If you mix your ingredients right and you follow the step-by-step procedures, the temperature settings and so forth, it's a relatively easy process to learn. It's somewhat expensive for startup if you're starting from scratch. In today's environment, you're looking at probably an investment around $3,500. Now, this particular hammerhead is a little miniature of an engraving or a chasing hammer, and this guy's particular casting here is 14 karat gold. The ones we'll be casting tomorrow will be done in silicon bronze. But every tool that I make is completely operational. If you look at any of the levels, there's 3 levels in here. Here's a small one, this level, and this guy here. They all have working valves in them. It lasts 2 years. 2 years ago, this tool sold for $110,000. It was a world's record. I've got one in the car that I'm working on. As a matter of fact, I'm doing 30 of these right now. And it's ebony, it's gaboon ebony and ivory. And it's what they call pre-band legal ivory. It came out of a museum up in Ohio. And basically what the tool is, it's called a plow plane, but it's an early router, if you want to think of it as an early router. And it came with 8 different blades, and you can see it's got 1 blade installed in it here. And the blades were 8 different widths, so if you wanted to plow or cut a groove into a piece of wood, depending on the size of groove that you wanted to cut, you would select the proper blade, the right width. And the reason it's referred to as a center wheel, on most of the plow planes, this hasn't been attached yet, but on most of the plow planes, you'd have to adjust this arm and this arm independently. On this particular model here, by turning this center wheel when it's attached, it moves the fence. This portion here moves in and out, so it regulates how far away it cuts the groove in the wood. And they call it a center wheel. And this was kind of a Cadillac of the plow planes. It was the top of the line. But this particular one here, the reason it brought, $104,000, $110,000, forget the exact amount, but it was over $100,000, is this was made as a presentation piece by the company that manufactured these planes. So this is a very rare piece. It's a one of a kind. And I'm in the process, like I said, of doing 30 of them. And I've sold about half of them before I got them finished. This is what I'm going to start making. I've made I made a Kentucky long rifle this scale years ago, and since making the first one, I've done a lot of research and learned a lot more about the rifle building environment. And this particular gun here was made by a gentleman by the name of Art Holly, and it's one of the better quality miniature rifles, Kentucky rifles, that was made. And my goal is to make a rifle at least this good, hopefully better. And I've got some blueprints, original blueprints of Davy Crockett's original Kentucky long rifle, and that'll be the first miniature rifle I build. Will be an exact replica of Davy Crockett's original long rifle. This guy here is probably a little highly embellished. They made guns like this, but when I start building them, I'm going to research the maker and the school of the gun, and I'm going to try to recreate the exact detail of the original, you know, for all the lines and the inlays and the particular style of the gun that was made. This particular rifle here is a 3rd scale, which is the same scale that I'll be doing, and that's a scale that I've done for years on my miniature tools. Is a 1/3 scale. It seems to be a real common scale that a lot of the miniatures have used over the years. The particular plane that I was showing you earlier, the ebony and ivory plow plane, that's the only exception. I made that 3/8 scale, which is not much difference, but it is a little bit larger. And I just decided it would look better, you know, in a 3/8 versus a 1/3.
Everybody's talked very highly of you. You want to blow your own horn here for a minute?
Yeah, they're misled. That's all. I've got a few people think that I can engrave, and you gotta fool a few people sometimes.
Well, obviously you fooled a lot of people if that's the case. Tell us, how long you've been engraving?
Started in 1961. It was, you know, very crude stuff at first, and in fact, it went for a long time that it was crude. And but I stuck with it, and then finally my thing started to improve, and I finally was getting a handle on things, and now I'm doing work at a decent level, but I'm learning even more. I think that I would become stagnant if I didn't learn anything from one job to the next. I always think that my last gun was a practice gun for the one that I'm doing now.
So, well, you want to show us what you got in your hand right now?
This is something completely different. This is it's just a flintlock rifle that I built back in I think 1974. And this is how I got started at engraving. I started building muzzleloading rifles, and they all needed just a little bit of work, and so that's what I did. I taught myself to engrave, and then later on I finally decided that that learning from a teacher might be a good way of going, and so I got a chance to take classes from some of the best in the world, and oddly enough, they were able to teach me some stuff. It took a lot of hammering, but they got it in my head.
So what are you going to be doing tomorrow?
Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about either engraving or gun stock carving. Just depends on what they ask. I do both.
Anything else?
That ought to do it.
Where are you from again?
Clio, Michigan.
Clio, how do you spell that?
C-L-I-O.
Okay.
It's like Clio, but you know, Ohio isn't Ohio.
Ohio. Just leave the gun there for a second. Let me just kind of pan up it.
Okay. Would you like to see my best gun?
Mm-hmm.
This is quite an outing here, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is my my best piece so far.
Tell us about it.
Well, it's an over and under Italian shotgun.
I mean, you've got to be a natural.
It's got a lot of gold on it. I've got about 2,700 hours tied up in it. I build the stock and carve the stock and engrave the gun, and this is it.
And we're doing highly ultra realistic portraits and fantastic and things like that. And you know, he was like way advanced than the tattoo artist. And then he started doing this engraving back in, I can think about 7 days. You know, he liked guns. And like, I gotta find
Beautiful piece of artwork.
There you go. Let me show the other.
Okay.
I've been doing quite a lot of. I've got some books when I go to Japan twice a year to night shows over there.
We'd like everybody to start moving towards the food at the far end of the house, okay?
I've got some books. There's a Japanese tattooist. I'm trying to think of his name.
How long did you have to work on this?
I think I've got about 2,700 hours tied up in this piece because I made this. Like I said, I made the stock and I carved it. In fact, if you look at the butt plate, there's almost more stuff on the butt plate than there are on a lot of guns in their entirety.
I've got everyone.
I'm really not. I'm not a camera person, really.
Well, just tell me, you're an engraver, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you're here, you've got to be pretty good at what you do. What's your expertise?
Gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, you know, I do knives, fly rods, guns, pens. I'm all over the map.
Really?
Yeah.
How long have you been doing it?
About 20 years.
20 years, so you've gotten pretty good at it.
Well,
Or are you like a true artist that never thinks they're good enough?
I don't know.
Tell me about Ray Crover.
Oh, he's a master cutter. He's one of the best engravers in the world. He probably has done one of the most beautiful knives I've ever seen. He says there's something wrong with it, but nobody can find nothing wrong with it. He's good.
And you've been to his school?
I've been to his school. He's one fantastic teacher. He don't try to sell you nothing, and he has all the different equipment that you want. He's got the Lindsay, he's got the GRS, he's got everything for you to try, and let you make your own decision of what you want. And fantastic family, very talented family in the music. I don't think Ray can play anything except a graver.
Mudman, we're having, this is the Mud Inn.
How come you dressed up?
Hello, y'all. Okay, y'all through your interview here. I found that. Hey, all right, buddy.
You're looking great. I was lucky. I got that when they were first.
Can I have everybody's attention?
Pretty tattered up.
Hello. Hey, y'all, who's over there? Jerry. Hey. The eating the shrimp that Jerry brought up from Florida and the gumbo and the music is all in the tents on the back side of the house, and there's a fire over there, so if y'all can move that way.
You've been pushing somebody out of a mud hole?
Clean up a little bit.
That's what he's doing. I'm going to come bear hug you with all my
Over that great it was he's a sucker to redeem a fortune. Shout aloud in my soul, let the glad tidings roll from the land to the end of the sea. He suffered to redeem a poor sinner.
I am an engraver, and I live in northern Kentucky. And I've been engraving since 1976. 1985.
How did you get started?
Well, my brother was already an engraver. He had always been an artist in various forms and taught himself how to engrave back in the early 70s, and so he introduced me to it, even though we lived 3,000 miles apart at the time. I lived in California at the time, and he lived in Cincinnati, and we did a little correspondence, and I worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, and then eventually I moved back to Cincinnati when my dad got ill, and took up engraving as a full-time occupation for about 7 years. And after that, I became a part-time engraver, just doing it as a sideline. I found it was pretty hard to make a living just engraving guns, especially back in those days. And we're pretty much, I was just self-taught. I learned what I could from my brother and picked up a little here and there, but pretty much self-taught. I've never been to an engraving school or any of the things that people seem to do today. And that's kind of how I got into it anyway.
So, would you mind showing us some of your work?
Yeah, I've got a few little things here. This is a Bowie knife that I engraved for my cowboy action shooting set. I do, my hobby's cowboy action shooting, and this is just an inexpensive knife, but I needed something that had plenty of brass to engrave on it. So that's just a simple little scroll job with a bead punched background. And like I said, the knife itself is nothing much, but I need a little vehicle just to show off my work at the cowboy action matches. This is a 410 shotgun frame from a Spanish shotgun that I did with what I call my double bevel scroll work. It's something I worked out several years ago to create a look of relief without doing a lot of shading or backgrounding. It involves two different bevel type of cuts. And then up here on the top, I did a little relief chiseling on the fences of this gun. Eventually, I believe I'll blue this piece, but it helps to show it in the white because engravers like to see how things are done. And this is a side plate from a Winchester Model 42 410 gauge shotgun. I just brought the side plate with me so I wouldn't have to bring the whole gun. I did this about 15 years ago. I found that the steel in a Model 42 side plate's extremely hard, so I had a lot of problems keeping points on my gravers and getting a good cut with this. But I couldn't anneal it for fear of warping the plate, so I just had to cut it the way it was. And this is a pistol I carried when I was a police officer. I just cut the engraving right through the bluing and put a badge on the side of it. And I carried this for a long time in my holster.
Very nice.
So there's just a few samples of things. I brought one here that I was working on the day I left for Tennessee. A friend of mine wanted me to engrave the side plates from a 73 Winchester, and this one you can kind of see the process. I glue it with super glue to a piece of wood, and then I paint it with a sort of concoction of white paint that I make up, and then I draw the design on with a pencil, and then you can see that it's pretty much finished with the chiseling on all the primary cuts here. And I cut that with a 120-degree graver. Up until recently, I always cut everything with a 90-degree graver or an anglette because that's all I knew how to do. And then thanks to things that I saw on the internet, I learned how to make a 120-degree graver. And so I thought I'd try it with that one. And it works pretty good because some of the bevels on the cuts I can get a little bit easier without leaning the tool over too much. But it's a fairly simple job.
So What do you think of this get-together that Scott's put together?
Well, this is a great thing. You know, you never really get to meet a lot of engravers at once, and even if you go to something like the Blade Show or the Figa Show, you're always dealing with customers, and they got to come first before you start talking shop with engravers. So this is an opportunity for engravers to talk shop amongst themselves and not have the interruption of customers and buyers and dealers and people that you have to attend to constantly. You can just focus on what you want to, and you can learn a lot of things from other engravers. I think it's probably the best way you can learn something is talking to others in a profession. There's no one way to do anything, and everybody has little techniques that they use, and what somebody thinks is the simplest thing that they do, it can really turn a light on in your head that you've never thought of before. So it's great, and it's great that Scott's gone to all the work of doing this, and I hope everybody else enjoys it as much as I do.
Anything else?
No, that's about it. Just wish all my colleagues in the field good luck, and keep your gravers sharp and your head down. Thanks a lot.
First of all, let me see a show of hands of anybody that's ever seen investment casting done. One.
I've seen centrifugal.
Okay, centrifugal. What we're going to do this morning is what they call investment or lost wax casting, and it's just one of the many ways that you can do it. Instead of doing centrifugal, where you actually sling the hot flash, molded flash around in a centrifugal machine, and it spins around and slings the metal up inside the cavity, we're going to use what they call vacuum assist. The flash that we're going to cast, I put them in the oven last night, and they've been burning out, and the wax has been burning out, and the flash have been conditioned, taken through a rigorous burnout cycle. And so they're ready to pour, and what we'll do is what we call vacuum assist. So when I get the molten metal in the crucible, and I'm ready to pour the casting, I'll open up the oven here and grab a flask and set it up on this pink pad here, orange pad, and I've got a foot switch down there that I'll step on and turn on the vacuum pump. And what will happen is that vacuum will draw through the investment, and when I say investment, we're talking about this white powdery material that looks very similar to plaster of Paris. And it was mixed up. What you do is you take a wax model, and one of the things that we're going to cast today is this little chasing hammer. Here's an example of one in gold. And what we did is we treed up a bunch of them, and each flask will have anywhere from 4 to 16 of these hammers inside of it. There'll be like a pole or a tree, and these will be attached to the side of it like limbs on a tree. So what I did is after I got all the waxes prepared and got them mounted on a tree, we melted them and attached them to this rubber sprue base. So now you've got this base that's got your part, you know, suspended in it, attached to the rubber base, just like such. Then you take your steel flask and put down over it. It's got to be tall enough to hold the part too. And then you pour and fill that flask with the investment, with the white powder material. And it takes about 9 minutes for that investment to solidify and get hard. And then you wait about an hour or so, and you just take this base and twist it off, and it leaves a little cavity or a little indentation that they call the sprue opening in the flask, and it actually acts as a funnel to divert the metal into it when I pour it. But also it acts as when you got it in the flask and you're burning it out, as the wax melts out or gets lost, it leaves that cavity in the investment. Now, the detail that you can get with this casting, if done properly, is just phenomenal. This is one of the Jim Small slipper planes that he engraved, and I made the molds and all of it. And you kind of pass this thing around and look at the detail in the casting. Now, you got to realize that casting has been buffed and polished a little bit, but the detail that you can pick up with this process is just absolutely phenomenal. I have taken like a bumblebee or a carpenter bee it captured it, put it to sleep with ammonia, and said the blessings, and then I sprued him up. And we actually burnt that bee out, because when you do your burnout cycle on your oven, you're getting up to temperatures like 1350 degrees. So this bee disintegrated. And I poured it in gold, and the wings on the bee actually cast, and you could see the veins and the lines in his wings. So that's the type of detail that you can achieve with this investment casting. You could actually take a casting that had a flat portion on it like this, and put your thumbprint in it, which basically is kind of, I guess, leaving a little residue, but it's also probably microscopically pressing down the wax. And you could actually cast that piece, and you can see your thumbprint, you know, in the casting. The advantage of using vacuum assist, if you were going to cast this piece, whether it be miniature or full size, if you were going to cast this in sand casting, the problem that you got as you pour your metal into the gates or the feeder lines, you've got to have several risers and gates. So as the metal is flowing in, it's got to push out the air as it's going through all the cavities to fill it with the molten metal. What happens with investment casting with the vacuum assist, as you're drawing vacuum through that investment, it's basically displacing the air and the atmospheric pressure inside of that flask where the cavity is. And it's kind of like when you suck on a straw on a soda, you're not creating a vacuum, or you're not sucking it in from the vacuum that you're creating. What you're doing is you're creating a difference in atmospheric pressure, and the atmosphere is pushing down on the liquid and forcing it up into your mouth. That's what happens here. When I pour the molten metal, the vacuum's not sucking the metal down, it's just being forced down with a difference of atmospheric pressure from the vacuum. So any questions before we start here?
When you pour in your investment, do you have it shaking to get the air bubbles out? When you vacuum the investment, there's a bell jar that goes on this side of the vacuum unit, and when you first mix up the investment, you do vacuum it to get the air out of the investment, and then you pour it into the flask and fill the flask. After you fill the flask, you put the flask back under the bell jar to do a second vacuum operation. That's when you jiggle and shake the vacuum stand here, and it makes sure that all the investment gets settled and gets entrapped. For instance, one of the pieces we're going to try to cast here today is a flask that's got two of these little crescent wrenches. This is one part. The other pieces of it, the jaw and the screw, are mixed around in other flasks. But I've got one flask that's dedicated to this little wrench. And you can see there's all kind of cavities and cracks inside here that investment has got to flow and get inside of. And that's one of the reasons you want to joggle it a little bit.
Hey, Paul, you use a debubblizer on any of your waxes?
Before I pour the investment around them, there's a I don't know what it's a debubblizer or a surface tension reducer that you spray on there, and so it makes the investment flow and go around the wax a lot smoother. Now let me make a few disclaimers here before we start. I'm working with a torch that's not mine, which appears to do pretty good. The oven and the vacuum unit are my equipment. But in order to do a demonstration like this, you have to invest the flask ahead of time and then burn them out and get everything set up. Well, Murphy's Law, everything that I did yesterday when I poured and invested half of the flask just absolutely was a disaster. I will be shocked if those flasks actually cast, because I had my water temperature too warm when I was mixing the investment, and it set and got hard too quick. So when I poured the investment over the waxes in the flask, the viscosity was way too high. And then last night when burning these things out, I let it get away from me, and you're not supposed to exceed 1,400 degrees. This oven got up to about a little over 1,500 degrees, and the flasks were not cherry, they were white. And then there's a limit to the temperature that you're supposed to expose that investment. And they make investments, if you're going to cast platinum or some higher temperature metals,
that will take the heat. But the investment that I'm using is just for gold, sterling, and bronzes. So I could have destroyed some of the molds. But anyways, you'll get an understanding, and maybe we'll get 1 or 2 castings that work. Now, typically what I do is once I fire the torch up and flux my crucible and get ready to start pouring, once I fire it up, things they get a little hectic. So at that point, I can't answer any questions or kind of be interrupted, because you'll see it gets a little busy at a time. And so, as a result of that, usually when I fire the torch up and start pouring, I'll pour anywhere from 3 to 4 flasks before I cut the torch off. So what I'll do this morning is I'll probably pour either 3 or 4 flasks, and after they're poured, in a minute that you'll see the molten metal or the button on top of the flask, it'll be a glowing cherry red. Once it becomes solidified enough that I can safely pick it up and set it aside, I'll set it aside, then I'll start melting the metal for a second pour and do a second and a third one. And after probably the second pour, that first flask that I poured will be ready to dunk into the water. And that's the way you remove your investment to get it out of the flask, is when it's still hot and investment and the metal are still hot, you just drop it in a bucket of water, and that investment looks like Alka-Seltzer. At that point, when I'm ready to dunk it, everybody can come up and get around, and we'll have the torch and everything cut off, and you'll see the investment just kind of bubbles, looks like an Alka-Seltzer, and the casting actually just falls out in your hand. This is a part that was treed up. It's a little thumb screw, and you see how their multiples were mounted on this vertical tree or post. This is what we're going to do on the Hamlers. Now, another thing, because I'll open the oven real quick here, and you can see the assortment of what we got in here. I think there's 10 flasks in there. Now the challenge is we've got 10 flasks in there, and we're going to be one of the flasks. We're going to pour a slipper plane in red brass, and I'll probably do that the second or third casting. The rest of the stuff that we're going to cast is going to be cast in silicon bronze. Now the challenge is you get 8 or 10 flasks like that with different sizes and different arrangements of waxes. Some of the waxes will have a round sprue base, and some of them will have different sizes of multiple. You try to have to keep up with all that stuff. So what I do, and you'll see me constantly referring to this thing, what I do is make a little chart and draw me a little map, and I'll number the flasks by size and what's in them, and I also weigh the waxes. And one of the things that you've got to be sure of when you do this process, when you pour in the molten metal, and you'll probably see it happen once or twice, when you're pouring the molten metal into the flask, you have to have the right amount of metal weighed out to fill that cavity and fill your button. And you got to have the right amount. If it's too little, you don't fill your cast. If it's too much, it flows over. That's the reason I bought a few extra of these. Occasionally the metal will flow out, but it'll hit this silicon pad, and by the time it hits the silicon pad and rolls off, it's pretty safe. You don't want to pick it up, but it's safe. So you'll see me fumbling a little bit is trying to arrange the flask and find the flask that I want. And the flasks are not numbered, but I've assigned a number sequence to them by height and contents. And what I did is after you weigh the wax, and you weigh it in penny weight or ounces on a real small scale, similar to a stamp, or a light partial scale. So you figure out how much your wax weighs, and then depending on what metal you're casting, there's a number to multiply. For instance, if you're casting bronze, the number is 9. So if I multiply 9 times the weight of the wax, that tells me how many ounces of metal I have to have. But if I'm casting gold, that number becomes 12 or 14, depending on whether it's 14 karat, 18 karat, or whatever. So that's how you derive it, how much metal that you want to mix up. So as a result, because I've got a different arrangement of flasks here, I've got to make sure that when I set the right flask there, I know what it is, what's inside of it, and I pick up the right number. So you'll see a little fumbling around looking to match everything up. But once you get down to the last 2 or 3, it gets easier. Okay, got any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Let's see if we can burn Scott's house down. Where's Scott? Oh, there he is.
Jerry's got all the CO2 bottles.
Jones got them in the back of the car. Keep it out a little bit. Maybe we can put it out before you get there.
Okay, Jerry. George, you want to help?
Buddy, I'm game. What do we need to do?
You know anything about baking a pig? Roasting a pig?
Not a thing.
Anybody can roast a pig in investment cash. God, this is ain't nothing to it. Somebody does.
The only question about cooking a pig, can you eat it when it's done?
Well, you can eat these castings, but God, they're tough on you.
Tough on your teeth.
Tough on your teeth. All right.
You used to clean your investment out of your castings with. You buy anything special?
Bucket of water right there.
Well, if you get any in some small crevices and stuff,
Yeah.
straight white vinegar is wonderful, especially if you got an ultrasonic. It'll just take that right out.
I've never tried that, Gail. I'll have to give that a try. silicon bronze. All right, this next one we're going to cast is going to be red brass. Borax. That normally happens with a red brass. That red brass, the viscosity of it is really, it's almost less viscous than water, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So you get it, when it comes out, it just kind of, it comes out, but you have to dunk it and get it in the flask really, really quick, because if I just gently poured that red brass from the air, it will actually solidify as it's going into the flask. So you got to really be fast. Of course, when you're fast, you see what happens. But
did it still fill the mold?
It looked like it did because the button is filled out. I probably had just a little bit too much metal mixed up. Is probably what the problem was. Any questions at this point of what we just did? Surely somebody's got a question. Come on, Jim.
How you gonna get that out there?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that.
Just pick it up and throw it on the ground.
What? We just tossed it around in first person.
Paul, how does the vacuum draw through the investment? I mean,
Once the investment has been processed or baked through the burnout cycle, it almost becomes like a piece of chalk. It's very, you could actually, had a small piece you could suck through it. It's very porous.
Can I explain that?
Sure, go ahead.
Whenever you mix up that kind of plaster Paris, then you mix it up with water, and water forms a small cavity in there, and then whenever the water goes away, then you create a certain permeability. That means you can actually, if it's small enough, you could blow through, and that's the reason it fills that whole cavity by doing a vacuum on it, and this is what he's doing.
So it's drawing over the complete cavity, not just from the bottom.
It's drawing through the whole thing, yeah. And sometimes in bigger flasks you may have to put some more vents in there and things like that.
Here's the first piece that we poured. I wanted to go ahead and get it dunked before the investment got too oh my golly, most of them worked out pretty good. And pass it around. Now, if anybody wants to see, I'm going to dunk this second flask. You want to see what it looks like? Get up around the bucket of water here. But basically, this thing's probably still 700 or 800 degrees, and you see the investment just bubbling. And if you had a large flask, I've actually taken real large flasks and put them in a bucket of water like this, and you can actually it'll boil and be so vibrant you can actually see the bucket shaking on the ground. This has got two of the parts. It's four Hamlers, and there's two parts that I added on at the last minute. There's two little screws that you see at the top. Those are the screws for the crescent wrenches that make up the little adjustment on the crescent wrench.
You can use those as cast, the thread on the screw?
Yeah, you could use the thread. I'll have to machine a hole through the center of it, but the thread, yeah, you can actually cast cavities of wax that have been threaded, and if you compensate for the shrinkage, you don't have to do anything to the threads.
How much cleaning up do they require, Paul, as you take them off?
If it's gold or silver, very little. On the bronze, you gotta buff them with a little rubber wheel and maybe some Scotch-Brite and polish them with rouge. But this silicon bronze, once it's polished, will look like 14 karat gold until it starts tarnishing.
You need one of my magnetic tumblers.
Yeah, I do.
Throw them in that magnetic tumbler, boy, it'll knock them off in little stainless steel pins in there.
I've got a rubber one. Now, I'm getting ready to dunk this this slipper plane. Now, this slipper plane was done in red brass. And this red brass has got copper in it. And what's happened is this thing has been sitting here cooling. The oxygen that's getting through into the investment has been contacting the copper, and it's oxidized. And this casting in red brass, it really looks like junk when it comes out. It'll look like it's got a layer of black tar paper on it. It'll just be black. But they make a special pickle solution for bronzes and brasses, and you can put this in a liquid warm pickling solution, and in a matter of like 4 or 5 minutes, it will look very similar to the one that I passed around. Actually, that's one of the.
Pretty good.
That is one of the cleaner ones I've ever done.
Looks a lot better than you described.
You see the black right here.
Yeah.
That's normally the casting is covered in that, and I don't know what the secret formula is. It's the atmosphere up here in Tennessee or what, but yeah. Now this red brass, you can patina this stuff. They call it. I buy it from a Rio Grande, and they call it ancient bronze. And this stuff will patina, and you can make it. Oh, it's one of the most gorgeous metals in the world. Particularly if you want to antique it and put a patina on there and make a new casting or a new part look old. But we were talking about the detail of the process. Look at some of these shading lines on that casting. Well, we're doing so far, we hadn't burnt the house down yet. I'm really surprised at the hammers. What we're going to do before you get away now, if we have enough success here, we're going to cut these hammers off, and everybody can take a hammer home with them. Okay?
How about the ivory handles? Did you bring them?
Jerry has got some CO2 bottles. There's some ivory handles inside of the bottles. So you have to buy them CO2 bottles to get your ivory handles. Is that the way it works here?
My name is Adolf Spiegelhalter, and I've been in a foundry business many years ago, investment casting foundry business. He's talking about low money. Let me talk about high money. He's doing a beautiful job, and we call that a solid mold, and it is mainly non-ferrous. That means your jewelry is made like that, your whatever, bronze, brass, and aluminum and that nature. This is called non-ferrous. The investment casting process is approximately 4,000 years old. It has been used by the Aztecs. It has been used in the dynasty of China. Leonardo da Vinci used it, and some people in between. And then about 100 years ago, a dentist in somewhere upstate in the United States, he discovered it again. And nowadays you don't see the gold teeth anymore, but this is what they use to make gold teeth with that process. And the same process, they take wax and squeeze it in and form it or whatever. And from that on, there was a need for ferrous metal, and that means steel, stainless steel, tool steel, whatever steel you want to cast. And it went from that, and starting off with a different process by using molds made of aluminum, which this is ideal for what he is doing. It's perfect. But if you get into bigger parts like a valve body or a gun part, then, or orthopedic, like some of you may have a hip joint in there, hip joint or a knee joint, they made with that process. The same process, except, like I said, you start off with an aluminum casting, and it depends a lot on how many parts you want to make. This is what I do. I piddle around with aluminum molds, but I'm not in a foundry business. But you're starting off by injecting, on a big machine, injecting warm wax into that mold, which is done by closing up that mold, put it in a machine, and most of the time women do that. You inject, it takes about maybe 20-30 seconds. You take that tooling out, you open it up, and you have to pull pins. Like in this case, you have about insert, inserts, and then you wind up with a wax part exactly like that. Then we're still the same, so far still the same, but then from that on we're moving into, like on this part, it has a gate right here already cast in. Then we take a cluster, we take a piece about maybe this long and about inch and a quarter, whatever diameter, and we mount that wax, those wax parts on just like he did, except in a larger scale. And then we call that a tree, he calls it a tree. And then we go from that in a solution of silica binder. We dip it in the solution of silica binder and coat it with a fine sand, and then let it dry. We do that about 5-6 times and let it dry, and building up a ceramic shell around that wax. And what he did, he just poured that plaster Paris type material into it and formed it around. And then again, we have to turn that whole thing around and melt the wax out, and that is done by using an autoclave, or years ago you got by with you hang that in a furnace, in a gas-fired furnace, and the wax melts out and then a lot of smoke. But nowadays this is out. Nowadays you use an autoclave and you use steam and get that wax out of it as fast as possible. And then actually then you have a shell, whatever cluster size that is. And then you also use vacuum assist. You stick that shell in an oven, and we're talking about half the size is this opening, and then people with protection on it, they take that shell out and they set it in a pot, and sometimes they use vacuum, and then they have a furnace maybe with steel. They melt steel maybe 150 pounds or whatever, and then they ladle it or they pour that steel into that shell. And this is how the temperatures you're talking about, stainless steel, something like, or regular steel, 2900 degrees or so. It's get hot. And then again, like I said, I explained a while ago, the shell, by using that slurry, it is mixed up with water. That means that water goes away. It leaves tiny little holes in that shell. That means you have a lot of permeability. You actually can blow through that shell. Then again, you pour your metal in it, and we don't like to dip it in water because it kind of goes in there. Anyway, you take a hammer or a jackhammer, and then you hit that cluster, and that ceramic breaks off. And this is what he did right here, getting rid of it. But the shell is cold by that time already, and you have to deal with shrinkage of material. Aluminum maybe shrinks 2%, and steel shrinks maybe 1.5%. That means if you have a shell like a coffee cup, and you kind of it's gonna crack whatever you do with, and that's the same principle. Your shell breaks off, and then you start cutting all that off with a friction saw or a abrasive cut-off saw, and then you have a part I did a little machining on it, but it looks just like that after it's a little sand blasting done on it. And the ceramic shell, sometimes in those areas they use a caustic soda to remove it all the way. And then you have a product like that. Ruger has their own foundry, and they're big, and they're very smart, and they know what they're doing. Expensive too. But they cast, well, I play around with molds, and I made a tooling for a grip frame. I made a tooling for this frame, and then since we're playing with fast draw, Jim talked me into making fast draw hammers. And then I made, since they don't come with wide trigger, I made a wide trigger, and this is all done with that particular process. Now, any questions? Feel free.
Is the silicone or the sand shell, is that to protect the mold, or also the aluminum mold?
This is the mold.
Well, I realize that, but the aluminum cavity that it goes in, right? Isn't there aluminum cavity that goes in?
No. You make the aluminum mold is made to inject the wax part. This is what he called treeing it up. It's all same process, except the wax parts are bigger. Like this was wax one time, and then it goes from that. Then we divert into a different process after the wax is made. So far this was the same process, making the wax part and then treeing it up, but he is putting it in a flask, while in commercial like valves, name it, golf clubs, they all made with that process. Guns, you name, like hip joints or orthopedic parts, name it. I mean, there's so many, the food industry, because you can cast stainless steel and all kinds of leverage. And the craziest one I ever made was chicken. The chicken hooks they put on chicken, the chicken fights. Spurs, yes. And you can go that far. I mean, to whatever you want to do, you can do. You have freedom of design, you have freedom of materials. And I built 50 caliber machine gun housings where they just where they run them through like that. This is the process they use. Now it came through due to the turbines. Making a turbine blade was very expensive to do because during that time they did not have the machinery to go and make a turbine blade. You know what I'm talking about. Then they came up with the investment casting process because they can use some very high alloys and very strong material. And then they moved from that into the sporting industry to food industry, valve industry, and basically any industry, with the exception of the automotive industry, they still stamp things out. But
so your aluminum molds that are the piece that you use to make the mold, I take it it's oversized for the piece?
Yes, I have a certain amount of shrink factor built in, like in steel, something like 2.8% up to 3%. That means I have to make it larger. Now, if he makes a part, it's slightly smaller, but I have to figure that in.
And I take it if you're making a frame to match an existing pistol or something like that, you have to take into consideration the material that you're casting also.
That's correct. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I have to take that in consideration.
What about cross section?
About what?
Cross section, where you have a thin cross section here and a thicker cross section.
Well, this is the Foundry, then this is where you engineer that properly. It's still okay, but you have to, if you have a big section on something, then you would put a big gate on here, because what's happened then, your metal runs in, and this part, whatever is thin, it cools off faster than that heavy section, and this is where you have to feed it with a gate. Whenever that metal, everything has to be designed around it where it feeds that hot metal into it. Now this is 420 stainless steel. Like I said, you have freedom of design and freedom of materials, and you can cast aluminum. Now he could cast aluminum too, but it's not. Nobody wants aluminum gun parts. Okay. Any more questions? All right. Thank you.
Fuel rich, does that keep the oxygen, help keep the oxygen out of it?
Yeah, his tip's getting dirty. Jerry, you bring that bucket of water around front here. So right there. What I'm trying to do is get rid of all the extra residue in there. In theory, you should use a different flash for each metal. But this is a low budget operation.
Well, I know, I think the flame fairly fuel-rich, does that keep the oxygen, help keep the oxygen out of it?
Yeah, Anybody want to look at this one? Okay, I think what we just cast there was a goat head, a fish head, and 4 more hammers. This guy here should be ready, so we're going to dunk him. Now, when I'm back in the shop and doing this, normally I'll only cast maybe once a month, sometimes depends on what's going on. But when I cast, I've got a lot bigger oven, and I'll typically cast 40 or 50 flashed at one time, you know, because once you get set up, well, I'll tell you what, I don't know what's going on here, but damn, everything's turning out really good.
You ever thought about moving up here on the Tennessee?
Never. It must have something to do with the atmosphere up here. I don't know.
You should overheat them more often.
How are you making this mold? This new here. Yeah.
You take your wax and you mount it on this rubber base here, and then you pour it. You just pour it over that wax.
Put your mold in there and then pour that.
You put your pattern in there,
yeah.
And just pour it in. It's just like plaster of Paris. You just pour it over there, and then when it burns out, you melt it out in this oven. That wax comes out. So here's a wax pattern it's a broken one, but when that melts out, that leaves that cavity up in there. You know, that we're pouring the metal into. Get that little hammer, Jerry, that little one that's in that cup of investment.
When you set that on there, you're pulling the vacuum through it.
It's coming through the investment.
Through the investment.
They put them on there, it'll look like a Christmas tree. They like these?
Where you doing this? You got the mold?
Yeah.
This? Yeah, he has a rubber mold and he injects it in a wax injector.
I tell you what, the damn stars must be lined up right here.
Probably not the same thing they use to put on for broken armor.
Jerry, get that little rubber mold over there. That little it's brown. It's a little flubber. It's a little small mold. It's all right. Everybody that takes a hammer home with them, let me explain 2 things. First of all, I think you guys owe Tim Wells a round of appreciation because he came out to the shop and mounted all these things. If it hadn't been for Tim, we wouldn't have had anything to cast.
Give him a hand.
Yay! Now, if you run into, but anyways, what happened is we were running out of time, and I've got a major show next week, and I'm trying to get ready for it. So I didn't have time to make what I'm gonna call a good quality mold. And matter of fact, I didn't have the hardener for the silicon mold that I needed. So what I had to do on this hammer, there's a material, if you've ever had a prep in your mouth for a temporary crown, the dentist has got it's a two-part RTV, they call it, I don't know what the dentists call it, the people that manufacture it call it flubber, but basically what it is, it's part A and part B, kind of like an epoxy, and you mix it up, and this rubber will actually vulcanize in 3 or 4 minutes. It's quick. So what I did is took one of my hammers, and I got a little box, and I made a really quick and dirty temporary mold. And what you'll see, if I can get the mold open, you got a pocket knife there, Jim? Because it was a quick and dirty operation, the mold, you see the little metal rod in there, that's a core. And that's what creates the hole in the wax. But what happened, because this was a really low budget, quick operation, you see the little flashing, and you'll see them on the casting. Well, flashing is good in the fact that you just leave the wax alone, leave the flashing on there, or leave any external pieces of wax on the flashing, because it's so much easier when you're cleaning up the casting of this size to just, to hit that with a rubber wheel, a little stone or whatever, file or whatever. So it's better to have a surplus excess metal on your casting. So because we were under time constraints, I apologize for the flashing there, but had it been a perfect mold, the waxes would have been perfect, and as a result of cleanup on the casting. But hey, you're getting a free hammer, you can't complain, right?
You won't hear anything complain.
So anyway, this is what Tim had to work with, and what Tim had to do is take these little wax injection machine and pump these things full of wax and tree them up. So Tim was the one that actually treed these things up and shot the waxes, and I think he did a pretty respectable job. You can pass this guy around if you like there. Okay, that's I think that's all I'm gonna do this morning. Maybe after lunch, 2 o'clock or so, for the guys that didn't see it, we've got 4 more flash. We'll probably pour again this afternoon. But right now, any questions? I'll try.
When you make, where do you start from an original?
Oh yeah.
Original piece.
Well, your model or your master that you make, like for instance, I think this is the fish head. The master that you make a rubber mold to, you can make it out of anything you want to. I use 5 or 6 different materials. Sometimes I'll CNC it in brass, sometimes I'll hand carve it in wax, sometimes I'll do it in Delrin, ABS. It doesn't matter what the master is made in, because when you use the silicon RTV mold process, it's a cold process and there's no heat involved. A lot of the jewelers like to do a vulcanization where they heat and vulcanize the rubber, but I use a cold, so I can make my model out of anything. This particular fish, the model was made out of a piece of Delrin, and it was carved out of Delrin. Okay. And then the rubber mold was made from this. Well, so far we're batting 100%. We hadn't lost one yet. I don't know.
Paul, I want to do a larger one. What I need to do, I got my. Well, I do wood carving. So a guy's wanting. I made a fast draw guy. So I do fast draw. So I made a guy he's about 6 inches tall. I got a guy wanting 100 of them for trophies, to go on trophies. You can't buy nothing like that anymore. Well, I got the mold. So now what
You've got the model.
I got the master. So I done made a mold out of him. I whittled the guy out and I made a rubber mold. And I tried to cast a plastic and bronze but I couldn't get that to go. So if I want to do aluminum, I've got the rubber mold, so I put wax in that. And then if I want to do aluminum, I weigh the wax, the object. Then how many times on aluminum?
I think it's real low in aluminum, something like 7. You have to look at.
7.
And so that's how much metal you need, right?
And then I take that wax mold and make this.
How big diameter is it?
Oh, he's probably about that big. Little guy.
Okay, you can get galvanized pipe from a muffler shop and make these flasks out of that.
I got plenty of pipe.
Okay. And you just put it in there and pour your investment, over it and burn the wax out, and that's where we're at right now. In other words, we've already done everything up to.
So pulling a vacuum, can I rig up my vacuum pump to do the same thing?
Yeah. You got to have, your vacuum unit has to be fairly strong. In other words, try to pull.
It pulls it all.
Try to pull that cup off of there.
Yeah, I got mine to pull that.
So it's,
Mine's just for air conditioning work.
Yeah.
I can rig it up to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's all you need.
Got about a 1/2 inch hole in that, or.
What I do is I put an inline gas filter right past that hole there, so in case anything breaks loose and metal gets sucked down in it goes in that filter and just kind of disintegrates.
Mr. Pilkington, tell us about your son and what he's got. What has he got going on out here?
Well, he's having a small convention of engravers and sharing skills is what I understand. I really don't know a whole lot about it since he's been up here doing this. This is, I think, the 2nd or 3rd year he's been involved in it, and this is the first time I've ever been up here during this activity.
So what do you think of the artisans that came?
Well, of course, I'm by no means qualified to make any judgments. Everything seems to be extremely good. Of course, I measure everything based on Scott's skills, and I've watched Scott grow from the very beginning engraver all the way through to certainly a master engraver and above. And I've watched his work. Of course, I have some samples of what he has back years ago. And, I can say very impressed with everything that he comes up with and very impressed with what I've seen here today. But again, I'm no expert to qualify anybody's skills.
But you're the dad.
I'm the dad. That's about my only involvement up here. I'm a gun nut, but other than that, I like engraving. I like gun engraving.
Mrs. I'll ask you the same question. Tell me about your Super Scott.
Yes, Super Scott. His grandmother named him that when he was a tiny little tot, and it has been very appropriate. And then he met Rhonda, and she has been a super wonder woman. And they're raising 2 fantastic grandchildren for us. We're just very, very happy with where they are and what they're doing. They're happy. And, well, we just feel that God has just really, really blessed us and them. And this has been a neat event that we were able to participate in because the river's so high we can't rent canoes. Isn't that awful to be joyous over not working? But hey, that's what we are. Anyway, he has worked very hard, and they, hey, they homeschool the kids. I just cannot believe what they do. I wouldn't have dreamed of such myself. But he's been very happy with his engraving and then the guns and the Olympics and everything that he's been into.
Well, you seem pretty delighted by everything.
Well, we're very proud of all of them.
Well, I grew up drawing and painting when I was going through high school, and my father always collected guns, and so I grew up around a lot of nice guns, and he kind of suggested I get involved with engraving as a way of combining my interest in guns and the art. And I really didn't know what it was, and he didn't really have engraved guns, so he took me over to a friend's house that had some engraved guns. I thought, yeah, this is interesting. And he got me a set of tools my senior year in high school and the Meeks book, The Art of Engraving. And that was my Christmas present. And that was in 1981, I suppose. And I started practicing with it, started engraving a few things, just trying to learn my way around. And that summer after I graduated high school, a week after I graduated, I got in my car and drove 1,300 miles by myself, a big trip for an 18-year-old, to Trinidad, Colorado, and took a basic engraving class with Neil Hartlip.
And that kind of cemented in my mind that this was something that I wanted to do, and came back and started really seriously practicing, trying to improve my skills. It took me quite a while. My father runs a canoe rental, and being able to work with him, and I could practice my skills through the week and still be there to help him in his business on the weekends or the heavy days through the week. So it kind of worked out pretty good that my skills had a way to practice, and I still had a roof over my head. And about 1.5 years later, one of the local chief of police found out about me, and he just kept badgering me until I agreed to engrave a gun for him. I didn't think I was good enough. And finally I agreed, and it was a Walther PPK. And it turned out okay. I wouldn't say it's the best thing in the world, and I see it occasionally, and it's not bad, but it's certainly not good by standards where I'm at today. From there, I got involved with other engravers. Felt very fortunate to spend a week with Frank Hendricks at his place out in Texas in 1984. Spent time with Sam Alfano. Ron Smith was a big influence and help early on, and just became involved in FIGA in 1985, and FIGA really helped a lot. The camaraderie of engravers and the sharing of engravers at the show was a big influence also on my life. Engraving's been very good to me. It was my main source of income for 15 years. In the last 10 years or so, I've gotten into the Olympic airgun business through my involvement with Olympic shooting, and that business has grown to where I've got 6 employees now. So engraving's kind of a secondary thing, but I'm still very much interested in the art, both as a practitioner and occasionally as an author and an instructor. Engraving's let me visit a lot of folks around the world and made a lot of good friends, and I'm really happy to be involved with art and be able to host something like this.
So you really consider engraving an art form?
It certainly is. Many folks consider it a craft, but engraving at the ultimate level requires a lot of art skills and understanding to be able to create a piece that not only is standalone with the engraving, but that integrates fully with the flow and the ebb of the lines that are created in the piece that you're engraving on.
I'm gonna start out with a lot of you have asked me about gunstock carving. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to give you a smattering of everything. Is that all right? Is there people that don't want the carving, or
Hear it all.
Hear it all. Okay. I just got this Laterno vise, and just after the last Reno show, there was a guy that won this vise, and then he decided, after I made him an offer, that he'd rather have money than the vise. So I've got the vise, and he's got $400. So I think I got the better of him. But anyway, I was going to buy the vise at some point in time. But I can use a vise like this for a full stock, you know, for a bolt action stock even. But it gives me a chance to rotate the gun anywhere I want without having to have, let's say, a gun stock cradle to work on. That's kind of, it doesn't want to do a lot. It's not very limber. But when I start laying out a stock, in fact, this stock, do you remember seeing that that 95 Winchester that's in Tom Turpin's book on the back cover? Well, this is the stock from it. I had to pay $500 for that 95 Winchester a few years back, about 15 or 20 of those years. But the reason I liked that 95 was it was a takedown. It gave me a chance that to engrave it where, I can knock it down to something this size rather than a full gun that's maybe 4 feet long. Anyway, what I'll do is I'm going to start out just drawing a scroll. And there's
there's a couple ways of doing this. There's one way where you can actually draw your scroll on paper and then take a transparency, you know, from a copy machine, put over the top of the drawing, and then use a stylus, plastic stylus, and you scratch or scrimshaw the design right into the right onto the transparency. After you've got the transparency finished, you set it aside. Take a little bit of charcoal. This is just from a pastel set, and I use a knife, and I scrape some of the dust onto the transparency, and then I rub the dust into the crevice. Then I charge the wood with a piece of sticky wax, you know, just like this. Then I take my transparency, I put over the area, and then I take my fingernail, or one thing that's really neat is a popsicle stick, and go over it, and the dust from the transparency will settle into the wax. So I'm transferring the image. I do almost the same thing when I'm doing steel. When I'm transferring a picture, maybe a face, an animal or something like that, I'll make a transparency, I'll scrimshaw it, put the dust in, and then transfer it to either the steel or the wood. My tools, people early on were kind of joking with me. They'd say, they'd see my carving work, and they'd say, "What do you do that with, an X-Acto knife?" And I said, "Yeah." And they'd, "What?" "Yeah, I use an X-Acto knife." And they had a hard time believing that. But my X-Acto knives, I've shaped them different than the way they start out. These are, I believe, number 11 blades, and they're the only one I use. They start out nice and pointed, and I take them. I use the pointed one when I get to the end, or I'm doing a very minute carving, and I'm getting, let's say I'm working on an eye or the end of a scroll where it comes into the very finial. I'll use the sharp just to make that design alone. But when you get into the broader parts, you know, the larger part of the scroll itself, I use a blade that the end is rounded. I've cut the blade down, I've rounded it, and I've sharpened both sides. I want the back side sharpened because when I'm making a tight curve, then the square back doesn't ride on the outside of the line. And if you leave it square and your curve is getting too small, you're actually twisting the blade, and at some point in time the tip of the blade will break off. But when you use a design like this, here's one that's a little bit more pronounced. That's actually what this is, and I've got a number of them that are sharpened just a little bit differently. I also cut away a little bit of the blade here, so I'm only exposing about this much of it. So if I've got something that's in high relief next to a scroll, that I'm not scraping the other part at the same time that I'm cutting my scroll. But when I cut a scroll, I don't draw a knife very often. In other words, when I say draw it, I don't pull it. Although using a rounded end, you can actually push this knife. The reason I don't do that is because
if you get into a soft grain, your knife will want to go off into the grain. You can actually make a more accurate cut if you're cutting across the grain rather than with the grain. So, and when I'm cutting, I always use a plunge cut. In other words, I'm going to put the blade on my line, and then I'm going to push down, carry the blade a little forward, and I keep pushing down and making my cut. I don't know whether you can see this line or not, but the line, it's not very wide. But in some places, that's what I want. But if I want the line more pronounced, what I'll do is I'll come back in, and I'll remove just a little bit of wood on each wall of that line.
Making kind of like a V?
Yep. It starts out as a very fine V, and then as I recut it, it gives it a little bit more. It becomes a little heavier, and of course you use the thickness of the line depending on what part of the scroll you're at, or your own taste. But that's pretty much the way I lay out a scroll. After laying out a scroll, then scrolls need a little bit of a leaf in them, and I use the same tool to start the leaf. Another thing too, I called Ron Smith about a few months ago, and he has my DVD from the Engravers Guild, and he was looking at that, and I asked him, I said, well, did you learn anything from it? And he said, yeah. He said, I did. And I said, well, what did you learn? And he said, so if I go, well, I'll try not to, but it's a hard thing not to do. But anyway, yeah, I don't do this very well, and rather be strung up by my neck than speak. But anyway, after I'm going to just kind of flounder around a little bit and do just some areas for themselves that really may not be part of this particular scroll, but it'll give you an idea of how I shape a leaf. Okay, I've got a little leaf here that I've formed with this knife. Okay, I'm gonna give it a little bit more of a pronounced cut by removing some of the wood from each side of the line. And then another thing that's it's important is being able to find the right tool. What I do is I'll come back inside that line with a stylus, and I'll remove the wood that I've cut away. So I end up with having, just a little bit of just small cuttings. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but there's a leaf there. To give the leaf final definition, then I go over here to my my old gouges, and I find the right one, because I know it's here. My wife doesn't mess with my stuff, and I don't mess with her stuff. It's only fair. But anyway, I'll go back to that leaf.
You're basically just cleaning up the already cut line.
No, now I'm going to the inside of the leaf itself. I'm giving it depth. And I'm not going all the way through. I noticed that as I started to cut, it started to dig in. So that means that the grain wants to go down. And if I pull the piece out, it's going to rip some of the wood away. So what I'll do is just do a 180, and then I'll come back in from the other direction and catch up to it.
You usually work standing, Joe?
Only when I'm at Scott Pilkington's place.
Do you sculpt the leaves as you lay them out, or do you typically lay out a bunch of them and then go and sculpt them all?
Usually I do them right as I'm doing it. I finish one area, then I move on. But I always come back and access what I have done and do a lot of reshaping a little bit later. It seems to be when I've finished something like this, seems to take me about another half hour to an hour to go back over things and true some things up in one area, or maybe add something in another area, so I just redo the whole area. When I'm done, hopefully I'm done, then I can start putting the finish on it. Another part that I do, or another tool that I use, is I use scrapers. And I have got scrapers here. Okay. If I want to do a little bit of finer refining on the inside of that leaf, I can use a little scraper and just remove just a little bit. It's almost like doing ivory.
I'm not doing ivory.
Oh.
Is that a dental pick?
I was that close too. Pardon me?
Is that a dental pick or a dental?
Yeah, yeah. But I make my tools out of anything that's handy. One thing that's really handy is Allen wrenches. These are punches here, but I make scrapers out of the same material too. Now I'm gonna cut a little bit more away, if I can find the tool that I was using, or one close to it. Okay, I'm gonna remove some more area around that leaf. And really, the reason I'm doing this, this is for you people, is people ask me, okay, what do you do with the background? The tool I'm looking for is the one I first started with. Anyway, sometimes they take legs. But what I do is I'll use a punch, and I'll knock the wood down and form the background.
So you're compressing it rather than...
I'm compressing it. Yep, I'm compressing the background.
Do you ever cut any away for a deeper relief?
I have, yeah. But usually that starts out with the depth of my cut to begin with. And then I put a line, or there is a line right next to it. A lot of times you're going to have one scroll that's going to be passing right next to another one. So it creates a little bit of a void. And there I'll separate the two scrolls by knocking some of the intervening background down. So I'm using a cutting tool like this to start my cuts. I'm going to back up a little bit by saying, after I've got my lines laid out, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the lines. The next after that is I'll dimension the leaves and the stalks, either by using gouges or by using scrapers. And this tool also makes a wonderful scraper too. And pretty soon you also get a feel for the wood itself. Each individual piece and each individual area will be a little bit different. Sometimes the grain is going in one direction, or it's going another way, or in a burl situation it's going all over the place. But as you're working with it, you'll get a feel for it. So I've explained to you the transparency method of transferring the image from a drawing to the wood, and I've explained how to lay out the scrolls, and then afterwards how to treat the scrolls for them to look like the scroll that you want, and kind of give you a chance to experiment as you're going. But one other thing that I haven't mentioned, when I get to the end of a scroll, and maybe the end of the scroll is only, maybe it's about this big, and after I've made the plunge cut around that little part of the end of the scroll, a lot of times that little part will loosen up. So what I do is I get my handy dandy bottle of Zap, you know, my super glue, and I just touch it, and it'll instantly go right into the wood, and it takes maybe about 5-10 minutes until it hardens up. And usually what I do is I just work in another area just for that little bit of time. Then I go back to that area and redo it. If you find that the area that you're working on, especially scraping, and you find that it becomes furry, and because it's too soft, you can put a little bit of super glue right in that area, and it'll harden. Let's say like this leaf, it would harden this whole leaf up, and then you can go back and you can scrape it, and you can take it. You can take the thing down slower and with a lot more finesse. I think that pretty well takes care of the wood carving. Now I'll take some questions.
Does the super glue have any effect on the finish?
No, no. In fact, you can actually have an area where you've got linseed into it, and the linseed will actually, or the super glue will actually mix with the linseed, and it has a nice way of hardening the area, but still being just a little bit soft, where the super glue by itself is a little bit brittle. So yeah, you can put your finish right over it, and you won't be able to tell the difference.
What about if you're working with maple and you're going to stain the wood? Does it have any effect on the finish?
I think in an area like that, you probably need your stain in that area, and then put the super glue on top of that. Tell you the truth, I've never, I haven't used it.
Super glue does color it just a little bit on your stains, just a little bit. That's off just there.
What now?
It changes the color just a little bit on super glue.
What kind of finish do you use to not overpower your detail?
I as a rule, when I'm working with walnut, I don't usually stain walnut at all. There's times that I do, but for the most part, I let the walnut stand for itself.
So what kind of finish?
I use a stuff, I think they call it velvet coat. I've used Varathane, and I've used other methods, and they work all right. But this new thing I think has just been out or I've only discovered it about a year or so ago, and it's really good.
Velvet
No, it's velvet tone or something like that.
You're kind of wiping it on like a French polish type.
Yeah, and wiping it in with your with your hand and your fingers to push it down where you need it. Is there any other questions I can help you with?
Do you have a favorite wood?
Yeah, walnut. Yeah, and I like I like probably first a Turkish walnut, and then the European. It's close to the European and English walnuts anyway. But I like a European or a Turkish walnut. They seem to carve better. They're more resilient, and they're not as brittle. The worst is a hard piece of black walnut. I find that to be it'll crack on you, it'll break away, and it uses up all my super glue.
So what was the liquid you put on the wood before you started cutting?
Okay, this is Daymar varnish, and it's just something I had on hand. And the only reason I put it on there is I wanted to make it look like it had some kind of finish without working on this. I darken it up. If I was doing this at home, what I'd probably do is I probably would have left it light so I could see my drawing. I select these little pencils. They're mechanical pencils, and they're by Barrel, and these are a 0.3 lead, and I use that to work on steel as well as wood, and it gives me a piece of lead that's uniform. I'm not trying to deal with a point that's going to give way, and I have to keep sharpening all the time. But these little pencils, I think they do a perfect job for what I need them to do. But that's just a recommendation.
About how many coats of finish do you normally put on a stock?
Probably you'll end up around 7 or 8. It depends on how many times I go to a gun show and somebody takes one of my guns and bangs it into something else, and I have to go back home and take the dent out and pardon me?
Sweat it out?
Usually what I do is take a little bit of super glue and put it on the area and redo it. But while I'm sanding, I'm removing the other finish, and you have to rework that area again.
Do you strip them, or do you sand them down? And when you first get with them everything
usually,
on there, do you strip them first, or do you?
Yeah, okay. And then of course I sand them down, and while they're in this state, that's about the time to start your carving, without any finish on them.
How fine do you go on the finish before you start it? Do you go down to?
I'll go as high as a 600, but I start off with 220, 320, 400, 600. Yeah.
You do all your carving and everything in the raw. The wood's raw completely.
Pretty much, yeah.
No finish on it. There's no one base coat or anything like that.
Well, sometimes you get something from a company or whatever, and they don't want the finish disturbed. And if you watch yourself, you can do the scroll work or the carving right through the existing finish. But it's not a real easy task. Makes the job a lot harder. Yeah. Yeah.
But per se, you would use the stock that is completely in the raw to do your carving and everything on it.
Yeah.
Okay, you wouldn't if you had a raw stock, you wouldn't apply first coat of finish on it to get anything down base or anything. You would start from a complete raw stock.
But as I'm going, sometimes I'll put just maybe one coat of a mixture of turpentine and like varathane or something like that. Sometimes I'll actually just put varnish itself, or not varnish, but the turpentine itself. And what it does, it kind of softens the wood, and it also lubricates your cut. Okay.
What kind of emery paper are you using for finishing wood?
I go up to a 600.
But what brand?
What brand?
Yeah.
Whatever I can get.
Yeah.
friends of mine, a lot of times I've got one guy that works on cars, and he ends up with a whole bunch of little strips of emery, and usually they're 320, 400, 600, and he doesn't use them, and he just puts a rubber band around and gives me a whole passel of the stuff. So yeah, I use whatever I have on hand. It saves some pocket change.
But it's emery paper just for wood?
No, wet or dry. Yeah.
I was thinking about garnet and stuff like that.
Well, I'll use a garnet. Let's say that like the over and under shotgun that most of you have seen. When I was finishing the wood, I was starting out with a 220 open coat garnet, and that removes a lot of wood fast and very accurately too.